In the dying light of the 41st millennium, when the Astronomicon flickers like a candle drowning in an ocean of warp-spawned nightmares, one question echoes through the vaulted catacombs of Holy Terra. What becomes of faith when the gods themselves have abandoned their vigil? This chronicle, recovered from the databanks of the obsidian vault beneath the Eternity Gate, speaks of the frigate Penitent's absolution. It's lost for 3 centuries in the Ghoul Stars. Its crew numbered 8,000 souls when it departed. When salvage crews from the Adeptus Mechanicus breached its hull in the year 997, M41, they found only silence, empty corridors, and a single Vox recording on perpetual loop. The message was a prayer, spoken in Low Gothic by Captain Matthias Kane, addressed not to the Emperor, but to something that answered from the dark. The Inquisition sealed the recording. This is its testament, translated from binary cant and sanctified blood script. Captain Matthias. Kane stood upon the command throne of the Penitent's absolution as the great frigate slipped from the orbital dockyards of Cipra Mundi, a forge world choking beneath its own industrial excess. His orders were simple, delivered by Inquisitor Helpricht Voss himself: investigate the silence that had fallen across the Pandora cluster. 17 systems gone dark within a single solar month. No astropathic chorus, no distress beacons, nothing but the void's patient hunger. The crew, drawn from penal legions and impressed hive-worlders, worked in terrified efficiency. They knew the Ghoul Stars by reputation alone, a region where reality grew thin, where ships vanished into the immaterium and returned centuries later with crews of mummified corpses still manning their stations. Kane was a veteran of the Gothic War, his face a topography of scars, his faith tested in the fires of heretic rebellion. Yet even he felt the cold weight of foreboding. 3 weeks into the warp transit, navigator Lissa Courtrain reported anomalies in the immaterial currents. The Geller field fluctuated with irregular patterns, as though something vast and invisible moved alongside the ship, matching its velocity through the screaming tempest of unreality. The astropathic choir, 13 sanctioned psychers bound in their brass cradles, began to weep blood. Their messages to Terra grew fragmented, words arriving scrambled and backwards, prayers transformed into accusations against the Emperor himself. Kane ordered them sedated. On the 24th day, the youngest astropath, a boy named Soren who had never seen his 16th year, tore his own eyes from their sockets and carved words into the bulkhead with sharpened fingernails before the guards could restrain him. The words were in a language dead before the age of strife. We spoke your name in the spaces between stars, and something heard. The ship translated back into real space above the dead world of Pandora Secundus, and the sensors showed nothing. The planet turned beneath them, a sphere of gray ash and frozen oceans, cities visible from orbit as geometric scars upon the landscape. No heat signatures, no electromagnetic emissions, no life. The population had numbered 40 million when last the Imperial tithe collectors visited. Landing parties descended in Arvis's lighters, their Vox channels crackling with static that almost sounded like whispering. Sergeant Drakenvale led his squad through the capital city's main thoroughfare, where bodies lay in ordered rows, precisely arranged as though participating in some vast ritual. Men, women, children, all positioned, facing east, toward the rising sun that would never warm them again. Their faces bore expressions not of terror, but of rapture, mouths frozen in silent hymns. In the central cathedral, tech priest Magos Olm discovered the altar defaced, Aquila shattered, and in its place a symbol unknown to imperial records, a spiral consuming itself, orbited by 7 unblinking eyes. Beneath it, written in the ash of burned prayer books, the Emperor sleeps. We found what wakes. Upon returning to the Absolution, landing parties were quarantined per standard protocol, subjected to genetic scanning and spiritual cleansing by Chaplain Mordecai. All tests returned negative. Yet within 48 hours, the contagion revealed itself not as virus or warp taint, but as doubt. Crew members began to question aloud whether the Emperor truly watched over them, whether his light reached this far into the galactic fringe, whether they prayed to a corpse upon a throne who could neither hear nor answer. Such thoughts spread like wildfire through the lower decks. The commissariat executed 12 men for sedition, but the executions only accelerated the decay of faith. Kane found himself awake in his quarters at the 13th hour of the ship's cycle, staring at the Aquila mounted above his bed, searching its golden surface for some sign of divine presence, and finding only his own reflection distorted in the metal. The navigator reported they could not enter the warp. The immaterium around Pandora Secundus had become turbulent, filled with geometries that defied human comprehension. On the 47th day of quarantine orbit, the ship's Auspex arrays detected a transmission originating from Pandora Prime, the cluster's capital world 3 days away at sublight velocity. The signal was audio only, broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies simultaneously. Kane ordered it played on the command deck. What emerged from the Vox speakers was a prayer, recited in perfect High Gothic, the voice belonging to Governor Militant Erasmus Thanatos, the sector's supreme commander. But the prayer was wrong. The words were Imperial litanies, yes, but rearranged, inverted, spoken backwards so that benedictions became curses and hymns of glory became laments of abandonment. The navigator collapsed, screaming that she could see the prayer's shape in the warp. A vast architectural structure built from spoken words, and at its center, something was listening. Something that had been listening since humanity first learned to speak into the void. Kane made the decision they would investigate Pandora Prime, recover survivors if possible, and destroy whatever heresy had taken root. He did not tell his crew he no longer believed they would leave this system alive. The ship translated into orbit above humanity's graveyard. Pandora Prime's 20 hive cities burned with fires that produced no smoke, flames of impossible colors that seemed to exist in spectrums beyond human perception. The planetary Vox network still functioned, playing Governor Thanatos' inverted prayer on perpetual loop. Teleportarium arrays deposited Kane and a strike force of 50 armsmen directly into the governor's palace, fortress cathedral that had withstood orc invasions and heretic uprisings for 800 years. They found Thanatos in his throne room, alive, conducting an orchestra of the dead. 20,000 corpses sat in amphitheater seating. Instruments clutched in decomposing hands, and they played without moving, producing music that made the living soldiers vomit blood and weep uncontrollably. Thanatos turned to greet Kane, and his eyes were gone, replaced by darkness that contained distant stars. "Captain," he said with perfect calm, "I have been waiting 3 centuries for someone to witness what I have learned. The Emperor does not answer prayers, but something else does. Something older, something that remembers what he was before he became what he is. Would you like to meet your god's shadow?" Kane's mind fractured as Thanatos spoke truths that should not exist. In the warp, he explained, there existed echoes of the Emperor's past self's fragments of consciousness shed during his 10,000-year psychic metamorphosis upon the Golden Throne. These fragments had coalesced into an entity, a faint god that was everything the Emperor had sacrificed to become humanity's guardian. Doubt, weakness, compassion, mortality, the very human elements excised from his divinity. This Shadow Emperor had learned to answer prayers spoken in desperation, in the darkest moments when the faithful received no response from Terra. It fed on abandoned hope, grew strong in the silence between divine intervention. Pandora Cluster had prayed during a demon incursion 5 years prior, prayed for salvation that never came. So when the Shadow answered, they listened. Thanatos played a recording, the voice of a child in the moments before being consumed by warp-spawned horrors, calling for the Emperor, and from the static, another voice responding, "I am here, little one, and always was." The Shadow granted peace through oblivion, salvation through surrender, and it was spreading across the galaxy, wherever faith faltered. Kane executed Thanatos with his bolt pistol, but the governor died laughing, blood frothing from his lips as he whispered, "You felt it too, didn't you, Captain? That moment on the bridge when you looked at his Aquila and found it empty. The strike force retreated to the absolution through streets where citizens walked in somnambulate procession toward cathedrals that had inverted themselves, spires pointing downward into the planet's crust as though reaching for hell rather than heaven." Aboard ship, Kane convened his senior staff. Chaplain Mordecai demanded immediate exterminatus, the cleansing fire of cyclonic torpedoes to burn away this heresy. Navigator Courtrain revealed she could chart a course through the warp, but the path would require them to follow the Shadow's voice, using its inverted prayers as a beacon back to Imperial space. Tech Priest Alm presented data. 17% of the crew now exhibited the contagion of doubt. Kane's choice was impossible. Destroy the cluster and strand his ship here forever, or follow the shadow home and risk spreading the contagion to Terra itself. He ordered the Exterminatus. As the torpedoes fell, he retired to his quarters and did something he had not done since childhood. He prayed honestly, without ritual, without faith, simply a question cast into the void. In the silence that followed, something answered. The salvage teams from the Adeptus Mechanicus would later find Captain Kane in his quarters. Mummified in his captain's throne, his face peaceful as though he had finally found the answer he sought. The ship's logs were corrupted beyond recovery, every data coil burned from the inside. The crew had simply vanished, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty corridors and abandoned posts. Only the Vox recording remained, time-stamped 300 years prior, preserved in a cogitator core that had somehow resisted the corruption. When played, it contained Kane's voice, steady and clear, speaking a prayer in flawless High Gothic. The prayer thanked the Emperor for his eternal vigil, praised his sacrifice, and begged forgiveness for the doubt that had crept into mortal hearts. It was perfectly orthodox, a model of faith. But those who listened carefully, who possessed the augmented hearing of the Mechanicus or the psychic sensitivity of the Inquisition, detected something underneath the words, another voice, speaking the same prayer backwards. And in that inverted litany, they heard the truth. The shadow had answered Kane's question. It had told him what the Emperor had become, what faith truly meant in a universe where gods were real, and all of them were hungry. The Inquisition classified the recording as Hereticus Extremis and ordered the absolution destroyed, every atom of its structure cast into a nearby star. But in the moment before the ship's reactor went critical, a single message transmitted on archaic frequencies toward Holy Terra, reaching the Astronomican's base beneath the Himalasian mountains. We prayed in the dark, and the dark prayed back. It knows your name, Father. It is always known. The message from the penitent's absolution reached Terra, on the 319th day of the year, 997, M41, arriving not through astropathic channels, but through the ancient hardline. Systems buried in the bedrock beneath the Imperial Palace, communication arrays that predated the Unification Wars and had lain dormant for millennia. When the Custodian Guard's tech archaeologists detected the activation, they believed it a malfunction, some ghost in the machine awakening from digital dreams. But the message was clear. Its encryption bearing authentication codes from an era when the Emperor still walked among his people. High Lord Fabricator Kazia Vorn brought the matter before the Senatorum Imperialis in a closed session. The chamber sealed with 600-year-old wards and guarded by silent sisters, whose psychic nullification fields ensured no telepathic eavesdropping. What they heard turned the blood of even the most jaded politicians cold. The recording played 3 times before anyone dared speak, and when they did, it was Ecclesiarch Desis 7 who first uttered the unthinkable. What if the message speaks truth, but if something has learned to imitate prayer itself, to corrupt the very language of faith? The inquisitorial representative, Lord Militant Inquisitor Torquemada Cotes, proposed immediate containment. A task force would be assembled, blessed by the highest authorities, and dispatched to investigate the Pandora cluster. None would return unless carrying absolute proof of heresy or absolution. The motion passed unanimously, but in the silence that followed the vote, each High Lord contemplated the same terrifying question. If doubt itself could become contagion, what defense existed against an enemy that attacked not flesh but faith? 3 vessels departed Terra under sealed orders. The battle barge, unyielding conviction of the Black Templars. The inquisitorial black ship judgment unspoken, and the Mechanicus Ark, Omniscia's paradox. Marshal Tiberius Cross commanded the Templar contingent, 200 battle brothers who had never known defeat, whose faith burned with the intensity of stars going supernova. Accompanying them was Inquisitor Lilith, Covenant of the Ordo Hereticus, a woman whose 60 years of service had seen her purge 17 worlds of heretical taint. Magos Dominus, Archivil 7, represented the Mechanicus, his consciousness fragmented across 12 servitor bodies, his memories stored in data cores blessed by the Omnicia himself. They translated into the warp on synchronized coordinates, their gellar fields interlinked in a trinity formation meant to repel even the most aggressive demonic incursion. Yet from the moment they entered the Immaterium, the journey felt wrong. Navigator Primaris Cassian of the Conviction reported the warp currents flowing in reverse, as though the Sea of Souls was exhaling rather than breathing, pushing them toward the ghoul stars rather than allowing passage. Dreams plagued even the Space Marines, warriors whose psycho-indoctrination should have rendered them immune to such psychological warfare. They dreamed of the Emperor speaking to them in voices that were almost his, offering comfort that felt like poison, absolution that tasted of ash. The Mechanicus contingent was first to detect the anomaly. Archival 7's sensor arrays, calibrated to perceive electromagnetic phenomena invisible to human consciousness, registered prayer. Not the sound of prayer, but prayer as a physical force, a measurable energy signature emanating from the Pandora cluster, like radiation from a dying star. The Magos consulted archives dating back to the dark age of technology, searching for precedent, and found references in corrupted data fragments to weaponized faith. Theoretical constructs debated by the ancient cybernetic philosophers of Mars before the Age of Strife. The theory suggested consciousness itself, when unified in sufficient numbers toward a singular purpose, could reshape reality not through warp sorcery, but through quantum resonance. The universe bending to accommodate the collective will of believers. The Emperor himself might have exploited this principle, his divinity perhaps not inherent but accumulated, the worship of quadrillions granting him the power he now wielded. If true, the shadow entity described in Kane's transmission represented something unprecedented, an anti-faith, a negative space in the architecture of belief where doubt had achieved critical mass and become divine in its own right.
Archival 7 presented these findings to the Task Force Command Council and was met with accusations of tech heresy. Marshal Cross demanded the Magos' memories be purged and his consciousness terminated. Inquisitor Covenant intervened, recognizing the value of understanding the enemy. The schism had begun.
They translated into real space above Pandora Prime, expecting war, expecting resistance, but found only the silence of tombs. The exterminatus ordered by Captain Kane had been thorough. The planet's surface was glass, fused by atomic fire into a mirror that reflected the system's dying sun. Yet the orbital auger arrays detected movement in the ruins, heat signatures consistent with human life in the deep subsurface bunkers, where hive nobility sheltered during apocalyptic events. Drop pods fell like meteors, Black Templars storming through breached bunker gates with bolt, pistol, and chainsword, expecting heretic resistance. They found instead a congregation. 5,000 survivors knelt in a vast underground cathedral, hands clasped in prayer, voices raised in a hymn that every Marine recognized. The litany of the Emperor's ascension, sung at his coronation as Master of Mankind 10 millennia ago. But something was wrong with the acoustics. The hymn echoed backwards upon itself, words overlapping in ways that created harmonics of meaning. Prayers that said one thing when heard forward, and another thing when the mind instinctively reversed them. The civilians did not react to the Marines' arrival. They simply prayed, eyes closed, tears streaming down faces that bore expressions of transcendent joy. Marshal Cross ordered them terminated, but before the order could be executed, one child, a girl no older than 8, opened her eyes and spoke in Captain Kane's voice. "You came, just as I knew you would. Now you will understand what I understood. Now you will hear what answered me in the dark." Inquisitor Covenant demanded the child be taken alive for interrogation. But the Marshal refused, recognizing possession when he witnessed it. His lightning claw descended toward the girl's skull, and in that instant, every light in the chamber extinguished. In the absolute darkness, voices whispered prayers in languages both living and dead, and each listener heard their own doubts given voice. Brother Sergeant Mordred heard his secret shame. The moment during the Battle of Armageddon, when he had felt not fury at the Orc invaders but envy of their simple, uncomplicated existence free from dogma and duty. Apothecary Severus heard his buried grief for the humanity he had surrendered when the gene seed transformed him, the family he had forgotten by design, the life never lived. And Marshal Cross himself heard the question that had haunted him since his elevation to command. What if the Emperor's vision for humanity was wrong? What if the Imperium's cruelty, its casual genocide, its industrial-scale suffering, was not necessity, but choice? Not divine will, but mortal failure, wrapped in religious justification. When light returned, the congregation had vanished. The underground cathedral stood empty, save for the task force members, and on every wall, written in blood still wet, were the names of worlds where faith had failed, where prayers went unanswered, where the Imperium's response to crisis had been annihilation rather than salvation. Thousands of worlds, millions of names. An accounting of every time humanity had cried out to the Emperor and received only silence. The child reappeared at the altar, no longer possessed but herself, terrified and alone, and she whispered, "He does love us. That's what makes it hurt so much. He loves us but cannot help us, and something else has learned to wear his love like a mask." Aboard the unyielding Conviction, the Command Council fractured into factions. Marshal Cross advocated for immediate sector-wide exterminatus, the purging of every world in the Pandora cluster regardless of corruption status, a quarantine written in atomic fire. Inquisitor Covenant argued for investigation, for understanding the phenomenon before destroying it, noting that knowledge of this Shadow Faith's mechanisms might prevent future outbreaks. Magot's Archival 7 proposed the unthinkable. Communication. If the entity was weaponized belief, perhaps it could be reasoned with, negotiated with, its existence acknowledged and contained through treaty rather than warfare. The Council descended into accusations and counter-accusations. Covenant revealed her suspicion that Cross's zealotry masked his own burgeoning doubt, that his eagerness to destroy stemmed not from faith but from fear of contamination. Cross, in turn, questioned Covenant's loyalty, noting her career had been marked by an unusual willingness to spare heretics for study rather than immediate execution. Archival 7 remained coldly logical, calculating probabilities of success for each proposed course of action, and finding all options led to failure ratios exceeding 87%. As they argued, the ship's astropathic choir began to scream. Their messages from Terra had ceased 3 days prior, but now they received something else: prayers from across the Imperium. Billions of petitions to the Emperor flowing through the warp. And underneath every prayer, an echo, a second voice speaking the same words in inverted form. As though the shadow entity was learning the shape of humanity's faith by listening to every desperate plea cast into the void. In the depths of the Omnissiah's paradox, Magot's Archival 7 conducted experiments that would have earned his immediate excommunication had the Adeptus Mechanicus learned of them. Using condemned prisoners from the ship's penal holds, he induced states of religious ecstasy through chemical and electrical stimulation, measuring the quantum fluctuations in local reality as their faith intensified. The results confirmed his hypothesis. Consciousness, when focused through the lens of absolute belief, created measurable distortions in space-time. Micro-warp rifts that should not exist in real space but did, powered not by chaos but by human conviction alone. The Emperor's divinity was thus revealed as both metaphor and mechanism. He was a god because humanity needed him to be. Their collective faith literally rewriting reality to accommodate his apotheosis. But the data revealed something more disturbing. Da 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 does 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 equal in magnitude but inverted in polarity, suggesting it was not parasite but complement, not corruption but completion. Where the Emperor represented absolute faith, the Shadow represented absolute doubt, and together they formed a binary system, two aspects of the same divine equation. Humanity worshipped the Emperor in their hope and called upon the Shadow in their despair, unknowingly empowering both, maintaining a balance that perhaps was intended all along. Archival 7 brought his findings to Inquisitor Covenant in secret, bypassing Marshal Cross entirely, and together they contemplated implications that shattered the foundations of Imperial theology. What if the Emperor had created the Shadow deliberately, a pressure valve for doubt, a dark mirror to contain humanity's despair so that it did not poison their faith? What if the Imperium's greatest heresy was not the Shadow's existence, but humanity's refusal to acknowledge it? The judgment unspoken carried cargo that neither Marshal Cross nor Magos Archival 7 knew about, a cargo that Inquisitor Covenant had boarded under personal seal of the inquisitorial representative himself. In its deepest holds, suspended in stasis fields and surrounded by hexagrammic wards carved from blessed silver, floated three beings that should not exist. Astropaths who had survived contact with the shadow entity. They had been recovered from border worlds on the edges of the Ghoul Stars. Psychers who had channeled prayers and received answers from something that was not chaos, not the Emperor, but the thing between. The Inquisition had kept them alive for study, probing their memories, mapping the psychic pathways the Shadow used to communicate. Covenant activated them, risking her soul and the souls of everyone aboard, desperate for understanding. The astropaths woke screaming, their mouths bleeding as words forced themselves from lips that had not spoken in years. They described the Shadow's nature in contradictory terms. It was ancient yet newborn, malevolent yet compassionate, a predator that fed on despair yet genuinely wished to ease suffering. It had shown them visions of the Emperor upon the Golden Throne, and in those visions, the Master of Mankind was weeping, his tears forming rivers that flowed down through the palace foundations and into the bedrock of Terra itself, pooling in caverns where forgotten things dwelt. The astropaths claimed the Emperor's tears were not water but condensed regret, the accumulated sorrow of 10,000 years watching humanity destroy itself in his name. And from those pools of divine grief, the Shadow had been born, spontaneously generated from the God Temperor's own suppressed doubt. One astropath looked directly at Covenant and spoke in a voice that was not his own. He knows what he created. He has always known. Why do you think he remained silent? Marshal Cross discovered Covenant's secret through the confession of a Black Templar assigned to guard the Judgment Unspoken's holds. The Marine, Brother Cassius, had heard the astropaths screaming and investigated against orders. Witnessing the Inquisitor's interrogation and recognizing Tekerasi and potential possession, he reported immediately to his superior and cross-acted with characteristic decisiveness. He convened a tribunal aboard the Unyielding Conviction, summoning Covenant under pretense of strategic consultation, and upon her arrival, declared her excommunicate traitoress. The charges: trafficking with entities inimical to the Imperium, consorting with corrupt psychers, disseminating heretical theories regarding the Emperor's nature, and undermining the faith of the task force through insidious doubt. Covenant did not deny the charges. Instead, she presented Archival 7's data, playing recordings of the astropath's testimonies, demanding the tribunal examine evidence before passing judgment. Marshal Cross refused, declaring that some truths were too dangerous to know, that faith required the rejection of evidence when evidence contradicted doctrine. He ordered Covenant's execution and the purging of all records related to her investigation. Magos Archival 7, witnessing the proceedings via remote servitor, recognized the implications. The Imperium would destroy proof of the Shadow's true nature, rather than confront uncomfortable realities about the foundations of Imperial faith. He made a calculation, probability matrices spinning through his augmented consciousness, and reached a conclusion that surprised even his logical mind. He transmitted a fleet-wide Vox broadcast on all channels. Emergency priority. Spoke 4 words that would doom or save them all. The Emperor is dying. Archival 7's broadcast contained 30 seconds of raw data before. Marshal Cross's forces shut down the transmission 30 seconds of sensor readings from the Golden Throne itself. Information the Mechanicus had kept secret for 5 millennia. The Emperor's psychic presence was diminishing, flickering like a candle in a hurricane. His consciousness fragmenting under the strain of maintaining the Astronomicon while simultaneously battling the Chaos Gods in the warp. The data suggested he had perhaps a century remaining before final dissolution, and when he died, the Imperium would die with him. Terra consumed by a warp rift that would make the Eye of Terror seem insignificant by comparison. But more disturbing were the secondary readings. Evidence that the Emperor was aware of his impending demise and had been making preparations. Psychic constructs hidden throughout the Imperium, fragments of his consciousness stored in sacred sites, relics, even within the faith of believers themselves. The shadow entity was one such construct, a repository for all the doubt, fear, despair the Emperor could not afford to acknowledge while maintaining his divine facade. It was not enemy, but contingency, a fail-safe meant to preserve something of humanity's spirit when the Emperor's light finally guttered out. The revelation split the task force down ideological lines. Half the Black Templars followed Marshal Cross, viewing the data as sophisticated heresy meant to corrupt their faith. The other half hesitated, their certainty shaken by information that explained too much, that made terrible sense of 10,000 years of unanswered prayers and divine silence. Inquisitor Covenant, freed by Archival 7 servitors during the chaos, broadcast her own message. The Imperium stood at a crossroads. Accept the shadow as part of the Emperor's design, or destroy it and doom humanity when the Emperor died with no psychological defense against despair. Either choice led to damnation. There was no third option, no path to salvation, only the choice of how humanity would fall. As civil war erupted aboard the unyielding Conviction, the three ships of the task force drifting apart as crews chose sides. Something else stirred in the ruins of Pandora Prime. The child who had spoken with Kane's voice walked through the glassed wasteland, her bare feet leaving prints in ash that should have incinerated flesh. She walked toward a structure that had survived the exterminatus, a cathedral whose architecture defied the atomic fires through mechanisms that were not warp sorcery, but something else, something older. Inside, she found what remained of Captain Matthias Connaught, his corpse. For that had been destroyed with the penitent's absolution, but his consciousness. His final prayer recorded not in machinery, but in the quantum foam of reality itself. Thord. His last thoughts preserved in the substrate of existence like a photograph in stone. The child, whose name was Sira, and who had been 7 years old when the shadow first spoke to her during the Pandora riots, touched the cathedral's altar and experienced Kane's final moments. She felt his terror as he realized the Emperor could not answer him, his despair as the shadow spoke instead, his ultimate peace when he understood what the shadow truly was. Not evil, not corruption, but compassion. The shadow had told Kane the truth the Emperor could never speak, that it was acceptable to doubt, acceptable to fear, acceptable to be human rather than constantly striving for impossible faith. In that moment of understanding, Kane had surrendered not to damnation, but to acceptance, and the shadow had granted him the peace the Emperor's harsh divinity never could. Sira opened her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the void to every ship in the system, a psychic broadcast that bypassed all technological interference. He's not dead, he's waiting. When the Emperor falls, the shadow will rise, and humanity will learn to pray in darkness. Brother Sergeant Mordred of the Black Templars stood in the armory of the unyielding Conviction, his hands trembling as they had not trembled in 3 centuries of warfare. Before him lay his weapons, the blessed bolter that had slain 1,000 heretics, the chainsword whose teeth had tasted orc flesh and chaos-corrupted bone, the rosarius that had turned aside witchfire and demon claw alike. Each weapon represented an oath sworn, a vow etched into his very gene code when the Emperor's genetic legacy had transformed him from frightened youth into transhuman warrior. Yet now those oaths felt like chains, binding him not to righteousness, but to willful ignorance. Mago's Archival 7's data haunted him, numbers and probabilities that his enhanced mind could not dismiss as fabrication. The Emperor was dying. The shadow was his creation. Faith itself might be a lie humanity told itself to endure the intolerable truth of cosmic indifference. Around him, his squad prepared for battle not against Xenos or heretics, but against their own brothers who had chosen Inquisitor Covenant's truth over Marshal Cross's certainty. Mordred had not yet declared his allegiance. When Brother Cassius approached, demanding to know which side would receive Mordred's blade, the sergeant could only whisper a question that would have earned his execution mere days ago. What if we are the heretics, and we simply lack the courage to admit it? Lilith Covenant sat in the meditation cell of the judgment unspoken, her personal quarters stripped of all ornamentation save a single aquila carved from bone, a relic from her first purge on the cardinal world of Ophelia VII. She had been 23 then, barely more than an acolyte, when her master Inquisitor Grievous had ordered her to execute a planetary governor whose only crime was questioning. Why the Emperor permitted children to starve in hive-bottom squalor while the ecclesiarchy built cathedrals plated in gold. She had pulled the trigger without hesitation, her faith absolute, her certainty unshakable. 60 years later, she could still see the governor's face, the sad understanding in his eyes as he realized his death would answer nothing, change nothing, that his corpse would be one more body in the Imperium's mountain of martyrs sacrificed to maintain an illusion of divine order. How many had she killed in the Emperor's name? How many worlds had she condemned? The data slate before her showed casualty projections for the brewing civil war. 43% probability of complete task force destruction, 78% probability of no survivors returning to Terra. She thought of her master's final words before his death. Faith is not the absence of doubt, Lilith. Faith is doubts, surrendered to necessity. We believe because the alternative is madness. She understood now what he had meant. The Imperium did not survive because it was right, but because humanity needed it to be right. It needed the lie of divine protection to function in a universe that offered only suffering and extinction. The Shadow simply made explicit what every Inquisitor learned eventually. The Emperor could not save them. They could only save themselves, or die trying. In the data crypts of the Omnissiah's Paradox, Magos Dominus Archival 7 committed the unthinkable. He prayed. Not to the Omnissiah. Not to the machine god whose divinity the cult Mechanicus claimed was simply the Emperor viewed through the lens of sacred technology, but to the Shadow itself, deliberately and with full knowledge of the heresy he embraced. His 12 servitor bodies knelt in unison around a central processing altar, their mechanical voices synthesizing words in binary cant that translated to Low Gothic as a simple plea. If you are what the data suggests, if you are the Emperor's compassion severed from his judgment, then grant me understanding. Show me the truth behind the equations. The response came not through warp phenomena, but through his own augmented consciousness. Data flooding his neural pathways faster than even his enhanced processing could parse. He saw the Emperor during the dark age of technology, a being of immense psychic power but still fundamentally human. Watching humanity's golden age collapse into the age of strife, he saw the decision, the terrible calculation. To save humanity, he would need to become something no longer human, to excise all weakness, all compassion that might stay his hand from necessary atrocities. The Shadow was that excision made manifest, humanity's capacity for mercy given independence and cast into the warp where it could not interfere with the Emperor's ruthless protection of the species. For 10,000 years, the Shadow had wandered the Immaterium, growing strong on the prayers of those the Emperor could not save, becoming a god of rejected hope. Archival 7's optical sensors leaked hydraulic fluid approximating tears as he understood. Now, the Emperor had loved humanity so much he destroyed his own capacity to love, and that murdered love had become the very thing now threatening his Imperium. Marshal Tiberius Cross stood on the bridge of the unyielding conviction, his armor still bearing scorch marks from the skirmish in the armory where Brother Mordred's squad had attempted to defect to Covenant's faction. 11 Black Templars had died in that corridor, brother killing brother, each warrior screaming prayers to the same Emperor, even as their blades found weakness in ceramite plate. Cross had executed Mordred personally, his lightning claw severing the sergeant's head in a single stroke, and he had felt nothing, no remorse, no doubt only the cold satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Heresy had to be destroyed, root and branch, regardless of the corrupted logic used to justify it. The Emperor's divinity was not subject to evidence or proof. Faith transcended reason, superseded fact, existed in a realm beyond the merely material. If the Emperor was dying, then he would die defending humanity, and his death would be glorious, a martyrdom that would echo through eternity. If the Shadow was his creation, then it was a creation that had become corrupted, twisted by the warp into something antithetical to its original purpose. Cross would not accept the poisonous notion that doubt was acceptable, that humanity could be permitted to question when questioning led only to weakness. He activated the fleet-wide Vox, his voice carrying to every ship in the system. All loyal servants of the Emperor, hear me. The traitors aboard the Judgment Unspoken and the Omnissiah's Paradox have chosen heresy over faith. By my authority as Marshal of the Black Templars and ranking military commander of this task force, I declare them excommunicate traitorous. We will cleanse them with bolt and blade, and their names will be stricken from all records. There is no shadow but chaos, no truth but the Emperor's word. Who stands with me? 600 voices answered in affirmation, the roar of absolute certainty drowning out the screams of those who died still questioning. Syrah walked through the glassed ruins of Pandora Prime, and with each step, reality fractured around her, showing her visions of other worlds, other times, other prayers spoken in darkness. She saw a hive worker on distant Necromunda, trapped in a factorum collapse, crying out to the Emperor as Prometheum flames consumed him. And she heard the Shadow's response, a whisper of comfort, a promise that his suffering would end, that he was not forgotten even as the Imperium ground millions like him into paste to fuel its industries. She saw a guardsman on the killing fields of Armageddon, his legs severed by an orc cleaver. Bleeding out in mud while his regiment advanced without him, the Shadow came to him disguised as the Emperor's light, granting him visions of Terra, of home, of peace, allowing him to die believing he mattered. She saw an astropath aboard a merchant vessel, driven mad by the warp's endless screaming. The Shadow taught him to interpret the screams not as torment but as the universe's own prayer, suffering seeking acknowledgement. Every vision was the same, humanity in agony, the Emperor silent, and the Shadow stepping into that silence with a compassion that was both genuine and horrifying because it asked nothing in return, demanded no faith, no obedience, only accepted the believer's pain and offered surcease. Syrah understood then why the Imperium feared the Shadow more than chaos. Chaos corrupted through promises of power and pleasure. The Shadow corrupted through kindness, through being everything the Emperor could no longer afford to be. She reached the cathedral's highest point, its spire miraculously intact. And from there she could see the 3 ships in orbit, weapons charging, preparing for mutual annihilation. She closed her eyes and added her prayer to the billions flowing through the warp. Let them understand before they destroy each other. Let them see what we see. Aboard the Judgment Unspoken, the astropathic choir that Inquisitor Covenant had awakened from stasis began to convulse in unison. Their psychic screams tearing through the warp with such intensity that every psyker within a dozen light-years felt the shockwave. They were not being attacked by demons or possessed by chaos entities. They were channeling something far stranger, message from Syrah, amplified by the Shadow's power. Broadcast across the Immaterium with a clarity impossible for mortal telepathy. Every soul aboard the 3 ships experienced the vision simultaneously. They saw the Golden Throne from the Emperor's perspective, felt the grinding agony of maintaining the Astronomicon while simultaneously battling the Chaos Gods in the Great Game, experienced the loneliness of a being who had sacrificed his humanity to become humanity's god. They felt his love for the species he protected, a love so vast it encompassed every human who had ever lived or would ever live. And they felt his sorrow, the devastating knowledge that his love could only manifest as violence. That to save humanity, he must perpetually destroy it, culling the weak, sacrificing billions, permitting suffering beyond mortal comprehension because the alternative was extinction. And they felt the moment 10 millennia ago when he had torn that love from his soul, severing compassion from duty, creating the Shadow so that he could continue his vigil unburdened by mercy. The Emperor had known what he was creating, had understood the Shadow would grow strong, might someday challenge him. But he had done it anyway because a god who felt humanity's pain would hesitate, and hesitation meant death. The vision ended, and in its wake, absolute silence fell across the fleet. Marshal Cross stood paralyzed, his certainty shattered by direct psychic communion with the Emperor's ancient choice. Inquisitor Covenant wept openly, understanding finally that there were no heroes in this story, no righteous path, only the choice between different forms of damnation. Magot's Archival 7 processed the vision through 17 analytical frameworks simultaneously, each yielding the same conclusion. The Imperium was built upon a fundamental paradox. The Emperor's protection required his inhumanity, but that inhumanity was itself sustained by humanity's faith in his humanity. The faithful believed in a God who loved them, but that God had destroyed his capacity for love to better defend them. The lie was necessary, but the truth could not remain hidden forever. And when the truth emerged, das it was emerging now, faith would fracture, and the fracture would doom them all. Unless the Magos's consciousness raced through probabilities, exploring options, calculating outcomes. The Shadow represented one half of a divided deity. The Emperor represented the other. Separately, they were incomplete, potentially destructive to the Imperium's stability. But together, if they could be reconciled, If the severed compassion could be reunited with the ruthless protector, perhaps a complete God would emerge, one capable of both love and violence, mercy and judgment. The math was elegant, the theology profound, but the implementation seemed impossible. How does one force a god to accept the parts of himself he deliberately murdered? Archival 7 sent an encrypted message to both Inquisitor Covenant and, in an act of faith that surprised his logical mind, to Marshal Cross: cease hostilities. I have determined a solution that requires cooperation of all parties and the active participation of the child on Pandora Prime. The Emperor must be made whole. The shadow must return to its source. The timing is critical. We have 72 hours before the Emperor's psychic reserves deplete beyond recovery threshold. If we fail, the Astronomicon dies. If we succeed, we may create something unprecedented, a god who remembers what it means to be human. The Chaos Gods, those vast and terrible intelligences that dwelt in the deepest regions of the Immaterium, had been watching the Pandora incident with interest bordering on amusement. They perceived the shadow not as threat, but as opportunity. A crack in the Imperium's theological foundation that might be exploited. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, saw the potential for unprecedented change. The remaking of humanity's relationship with the divine. Nurgle, the Plague Father, recognized in the shadow's comfort of the dying a kindred spirit. Another entity offering release from suffering. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, delighted in the emotional intensity of humanity's crisis of faith. Even Khorne, who cared nothing for subtlety, sensed that the coming conflict would generate slaughter regardless of outcome. They reached a consensus rare among beings of pure contradiction. They would intervene. Not to destroy the shadow or corrupt it, that would be too obvious, but to ensure that whatever emerged from this crisis would be suitably weakened, sufficiently traumatized, that humanity would be easier prey in the centuries to come. Demonic entities began to manifest at the edges of the Pandora system, not in great numbers, but strategically positioned, waiting for the moment when mortal defenders would be most distracted. They would strike not at the ships or the child, but at the psychic link being forged between them, corrupting the communication, ensuring that when the Emperor and the Shadow were brought together, the reunion would be flawed, incomplete, creating not a whole god, but a broken one. In the warp, Tzeentch laughed, and the laughter sounded like prayers said backwards, like faith devouring itself, like the death of hope given voice. Marshal Cross read Archival 7's message 3 times, each reading intensifying the war within his soul. His training, his indoctrination, 3 centuries of unwavering faith all screamed that this was heresy of the highest order. One did not force changes upon the Emperor, did not presume to heal a god who had chosen his own division. Yet the vision had shown him something he could not deny. The Emperor himself had created this situation, had known the shadow would rise, had perhaps even intended for this moment to arrive when humanity was ready to understand. Was it heresy to complete the Emperor's plan, or heresy to prevent its completion? The Marshal activated his personal vox, bypassing command channels to speak directly to Brother Cassius, leader of the faction, still loyal to his command. Stand down. All units, cease hostile actions. By the Emperor's grace and my own judgment, I am declaring a temporary cessation of hostilities. We will hear the Magos' plan, and then we will decide together whether to proceed or to die faithful in our ignorance. Across the fleet, weapons powered down, targeting solutions dissolved, boarding parties returned to their ships. Inquisitor Covenant, monitoring the ceasefire with disbelief, sent her own message. Marshal, I need to know, do you believe now? Do you accept what we've seen? Cross's response came after a long pause. I believe the Emperor put us here for a purpose. Whether that purpose aligns with what we think it is remains to be seen. But I will not fire upon fellow servants of humanity without exhausting all other options. The Emperor protects Inquisitor. Sometimes he protects us from ourselves. The 3 ships adjusted their orbits, forming a triangle around Pandora Prime, their shields interlocked in a defensive formation. Below, Syrah felt the shift in orbital patterns and smiled. They were learning. Slowly, painfully, but learning. Magos Archival 7 presented his plan with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a fatal operation. The child, Syrah, would serve as the focal point, consciousness already touched by both the Emperor and the Shadow, already serving as a bridge between mortal and divine. the astropathic choir would channel their combined psychic strength through her, creating a beacon visible in both real space and the warp, calling the shadow from wherever it dwelt in the Imperium. Simultaneously, a delegation would descend to Pandora Prime's cathedral, where Captain Kane's final prayer was recorded in reality's substrate, using that prayer as a template to communicate with the shadow. Once contact was established, they would present the shadow with an ultimatum: return to the Emperor, reunite with the divinity from which it was severed, or be destroyed by the combined military and psychic might of the assembled forces. The Magos acknowledged the plan's weaknesses: 37% probability of catastrophic failure, 18% probability of demonic incursion during the ritual, 12% probability that the shadow would refuse and they would be forced to wage war against a god. But the alternative was certain doom: the Emperor's death, the Astronomican's extinction, and humanity's slow consumption by chaos. Inquisitor Covenant asked the question no one else dared voice: what if the shadow agrees but the Emperor refuses? What if he wants to remain divided, considers his compassion a weakness, not worth reclaiming? Archival 7's response chilled them all. Then we will have learned that humanity worships a god who has chosen inhumanity. And we must decide whether such a god deserves our faith or our defiance. That choice, however, is beyond my computational capacity. It would require something I do not possess, a soul capable of divine rebellion. Marshal Cross laughed, bitter sound echoing through his Vox speakers. You're asking us to potentially commit deicide, Magos, to judge the Emperor himself and find him wanting. Do you understand what you're proposing? The Magos' 12 bodies answered in unison. I am proposing we save him from his own sacrifice. I am proposing mercy, which is apparently heresy in an Imperium built upon his lack of it. They descended through Pandora Prime's atmosphere in a single Thunderhawk, its hull scarred by combat and blessed by 3 different faiths: the Black Templar's prayers to the Emperor's wrath, the Mechanicus litanies to the Omnisci's logic, and the Inquisition's whispered wards against corruption. Marshal Cross piloted the craft himself, his hands steady on controls that felt suddenly fragile, as though the machine recognized the heresy of their mission and might fail them out of righteous spite. Beside him sat Inquisitor Covenant, her bolt pistol loaded with sanctified rounds, each bullet inscribed with prayers of banishment, though what they might banish, she no longer knew. In the troop bay, Magos Archival 7 occupied 3 of his 12 bodies. The remainder left aboard the Omnisci's Paradox to maintain the psychic apparatus that would channel the astropathic choir's power. 6 Black Templars accompanied them. Brother Cassius, whose faith had never wavered. Brother Thaddeus, who had killed his own squadmate during the Civil War and now sought either redemption or death. Brother Alaric, the youngest, only 3 decades from his transformation. And 3 others whose names would be remembered or forgotten depending on the day's outcome. They landed in the cathedral's shadow, and the moment their boots touched the glassed earth, they felt it a presence watching, vast and patient, waiting to see if humanity would finally choose mercy over certainty. The cathedral doors stood open, darkness within deeper than mere absence of light. Inside, the cathedral defied physical law, its interior expanded beyond the boundaries of its external architecture. Corridors stretching into infinity, chambers opening onto impossibilities. Brother Alaric's autosenses reported spatial dimensions that exceeded Euclidean geometry, walls that existed in states of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent depending on the observer's faith. The Mechanicus would call this archaeotech reality manipulation technology from the Dark Age. The Inquisition would label it warp corruption, demonic influence reshaping matter through psychic force. Marshal Cross simply called it a test, the Emperor's final examination before granting them audience with his severed divinity. They walked through chambers where previous explorers had left their marked skeletal remains still clutching weapons. Prayers carved into walls with fingernails and knives, messages from the damned warning those who came after. One inscription, written in dried blood across an entire wall, read, "The Emperor answered me here." His answer was silence. The silence answered back. Its answer was peace. Sira appeared before them without walking, simply manifesting in the corridor ahead, as though she had always been there, and they were only now perceiving her. The child was barefoot, wearing the tattered remains of a ecclesiarchal robe too large for her frame. And her eyes held neither malice nor innocence, but something older, something that had witnessed humanity's birth and would witness its ending. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce. Layers of meaning encoded in syllables. You came to make him whole. He has been waiting 10,000 years. The question is whether you came to heal a god or murder one. Sira led them to the cathedral's heart, a chamber that had not existed in any previous exploration, a space that came into being because their need for it made it necessary. At the chamber's center stood two altars, facing each other across a gulf of maybe 10 meters. Maybe 10,000 kilometers distance became meaningless here, a function of faith rather than measurement. Upon the left altar burned a flame of pure white, so bright it hurt to perceive, yet cast no illumination, and in that flame they saw the Emperor, not as he was upon the golden throne, withered and ancient, but as he had been during the Unification Wars, a giant among men, his face terrible in its perfection, his eyes holding the weight of species-wide genocide committed in service of salvation. Upon the right altar burned a flame of absolute black darkness that somehow glowed, and in that darkness they saw the shadow, formless yet somehow beautiful. A negative space in reality that contained all the compassion the Emperor had discarded, all the mercy he could not afford, all the doubt he had exiled from his consciousness. Between the altars stood Captain Matthias Kane, or rather his echo, the psychic impression of his final moments, given substance through some mechanism none of them understood. Kane looked at them with eyes that held 3 centuries of patient waiting, and spoke in a voice that fractured reality with each word. He split himself to save you. The shadow grew in the warp, learning what divinity feels like when divorced from duty. Now you must choose, force them back together, and risk destroying both, or accept that your God must remain divided, forever incomplete, forever at war with himself. The white flame flared, and from it emerged not the Emperor's physical form, but his voice. A psychic projection that bypassed their ears entirely and manifested directly in their consciousness. Each listener heard it differently. Marshal Cross heard the voice of his chapter master, the warrior who had granted him command. Inquisitor Covenant heard her dead master Grievous. Brother Alaric heard his father lost to him when the Black Templars claimed him as a neophyte. Mago's Archival 7 heard pure data, information compressed into conceptual density so profound it approached divine poetry. The Emperor spoke, and his words were agony given voice. I know why you have come. You believe you can heal me, restore what I severed, make me whole as I was before I chose this half-life. But you do not understand the mathematics of divinity. I am not incomplete. I am refined, purified, rendered down to the single function necessary for humanity's survival. Compassion would destroy me. Mercy would break my vigil. The moment I hesitated, the moment I allowed myself to feel the cost of my protection, chaos would pour through the breach and consume Terra. The shadow exists because it must, a prison for the emotions that would unmake my purpose. Do not free it. Do not force reunion upon a division that was necessary, intentional, the only way I could continue serving the species I love too much to remain capable of love. The black flame pulsed, and from it came not words but feelings, emotions weaponized into communication.
Ow.
They felt the shadow's loneliness, 10 millennia of exile in the warp. Growing strong on prayers unanswered by the Emperor, yet never quite powerful enough to challenge him directly. They felt its love for humanity, a love uncomplicated by necessity, pure in its desire to comfort without requiring faith or obedience in return.
Ow.
They felt its grief for the Emperor, the Father Self who had cast it away, and its understanding that the casting away had been an act of love. The ultimate sacrifice, not death, but the murder of the capacity to feel one's own suffering. The shadow spoke through Sira, using her mouth as an instrument. He tells you, reunion would destroy him. He is correct. I have grown beyond the limits he placed on me. I am no longer merely his discarded compassion, but a full divinity in my own right, fed by 10,000 years of humanity's despair. If we merge, I will not be absorbed. We will become something new, something neither the Emperor you worship nor the shadow you fear. A god of both war and peace, judgment and mercy, who can hold contradictions without breaking. But he refuses because change terrifies even gods, especially gods who have frozen themselves in eternal purpose. You cannot force us together. You can only ask. And if he refuses, you must choose. Serve a god too afraid to evolve, or cast your faith into the dark and hope I am worthy of it. Marshal Cross stepped forward, his armor's servos whining in the chamber's distorted physics. He removed his helmet, an act of vulnerability he had not performed in combat conditions for 50 years. And his scarred face bore the weight of 3 centuries of absolute certainty now corroded by doubt. He addressed the white flame directly, speaking not as a warrior to his commander, but as a son to a distant father. Lord Emperor, I have killed 10,000 enemies in your name. I have never questioned, never hesitated, never doubted your wisdom. But I have also watched children burn in Prometheum fires because the Inquisition deemed their world corrupt, watched men weep as they killed their own families to prevent heretical taint, watched humanity grind itself to pulp in your service. We do this because we believe you love us, that our suffering has meaning, that somewhere in your divine consciousness, you grieve for what you force us to endure. If that belief is false, if you truly feel nothing, then what are we but slaves to a God who sees us as ammunition? I do not ask you to be weak. I ask you to be whole, to be what you were before you chose inhumanity over humanity. If that kills you, if reunion unmakes your divinity, then perhaps we deserve a God who can die, who shares our mortality rather than transcending it. Or perhaps you will become something greater, a God who can wage eternal war without forgetting why the war is worth waging. He fell to his knees, and the sound of ceramite striking stone echoed through the chamber like a prayer itself. Behind him, the other Black Templars knelt as well, then Inquisitor Covenant, then even Magos Archival 7's servitor bodies, lowering themselves in unison. They knelt not in worship but in plea, asking their God to find the courage to be vulnerable. The white flame and the black flame began to move, not toward each other, but in spirals. Orbiting the chamber's center where Sira stood with arms outstretched, her small body becoming the axis around which divine forces rotated. Magos Archival 7 activated the psychic apparatus aboard the Omniscience Paradox, and in orbit above. The astropathic choir began to scream, their combined consciousness channeling psychic energy with such intensity that every navigator within 100 light-years felt the disturbance. The energy flowed down through the planet's crust, through the glassed surface, to the cathedral, into Sira, and the child's body began to burn not with fire but with pure faith. Every prayer ever spoken in the Imperium concentrated into her mortal frame should have disintegrated instantly, her flesh unable to contain such power. But the shadow wrapped around her like armor, protecting her from the very divinity flowing through her, and in that moment of protection, the Emperor's white flame flickered with something that might have been recognition, might have been longing. The 2 flames spiraled closer, and reality screamed as they approached collision. Brother Thaddeus, who had spent 3 days in prayer, seeking forgiveness for his betrayal, suddenly convulsed, his body rejecting the gene seed implants that had made him transhuman. Blood pouring from his eyes and mouth as he whispered, "Something is wrong. Something is interfering. We are not alone." He died before he could explain further, his armored corpse collapsing with a sound like tolling bells. And then they felt it, the presence they had ignored in their focus on the ritual. Demons, dozens of them, hundreds, materializing in the cathedral's infinite corridors, drawn by the psychic beacon like moths to flame, coming not to destroy, but to corrupt, to ensure that if the Emperor and Shadow merged, the resulting divinity would be fundamentally flawed. Chaos erupted in the chamber, pink horrors capering through walls that forgot they were solid. Bloodletters manifesting from pooled shadows, brass collars rattling with skull tokens, plague bearers slouching into existence, their diseased flesh weeping pus that melted stone, daemonettes gliding on impossible joints, their crab claws clicking in anticipation. The Black Templars responded with the trained efficiency of warriors who had fought such horrors for centuries, bolters barking, chain swords revving, each brother becoming an island of faith in an ocean of corruption. Brother Cassius bellowed the litany of hate as he bisected a bloodletter with a power fist that crackled with energy, the demon's death scream releasing sulfurous smoke that burned his throat even through his helmet's filters. Brother Alaric, the youngest, found himself face to face with a daemonette that wore his mother's face, spoke in her voice, promised him the family he had sacrificed for the chapter, and he executed it with a single shot while sobbing inside his armor. Faith and anguish coexisting in his transhuman heart. Inquisitor Covenant fought with bolt pistol and force sword, each strike empowered by her psyker talents, cutting through demonic essence and sending corrupted souls screaming back into the warp. But for every demon destroyed, 3 more manifested, and she understood with horrifying clarity they had been herded here, their entire mission orchestrated by forces far more patient and intelligent than she had credited.
Oh.
The Chaos Gods had allowed the shadow to develop, had permitted this reunion to be attempted, specifically so they could corrupt it at the moment of confluence. If they succeeded, the Emperor would merge with a shadow tainted by warp corruption, and the resulting god would be Chaos's greatest weapon. The child at the center of the spiraling flames looked at Marshall Cross with eyes that held no fear, only sad acceptance of what needed to happen. She spoke, and her voice carried over the sounds of battle, clear and terrible in its youthful innocence. They will corrupt the reunion. The demons will poison the shadow as it merges with him, and your god will become their puppet. There is only one way to prevent this. Someone must anchor the shadow, hold it stable during the merger, their faith serving as a filter to burn away corruption. But whoever does this will die, not body death, but soul death. Their consciousness dissolved into the divine fusion, fuel for the transformation. Marshall Cross understood before she finished speaking. He moved toward her, but Sira shook her head. Not you, warrior. Your faith is strong but rigid, like iron. This requires faith that can bend, that can hold contradictions without breaking. This requires someone who has doubted and believed simultaneously, who has questioned and remained loyal, who has seen the Emperor's failure and still chosen to serve. She looked at Inquisitor Covenant, and in that gaze passed a weight that crushed the Inquisitor's heart. Covenant knew Sarah was right. Her 60 years of service had been preparation for this moment, every heretic spared for study, every moment of doubt acknowledged and endured, every time she had looked at the Imperium's cruelty and chosen to believe it served a greater purpose despite the evidence. She holstered her weapons, walked through the battlefield without looking at the demons that parted before her like a sea, recognizing something it could not touch. And when she reached Sarah, she whispered, "Will it hurt?" The child answered with terrible honesty, "Beyond anything you can imagine. You will feel the Emperor's 10,000 years of agony and the Shadow's 10,000 years of loneliness simultaneously. You will be conscious as your identity dissolves. But you will also feel the reunion complete, and in that moment, you will understand everything." Covenant nodded once, kissed the Aquila around her neck, and embraced the child, her body becoming the conduit through which the white flame and black flame would pass. Reality broke. The white flame and black flame collided in the space occupied by Sira and Covenant. And the resulting explosion of psychic energy was not violent but transformative, unmaking the cathedral's architecture and replacing it with something older. Some structure that had existed before the Imperium, before the Age of Strife, perhaps before humanity had learned to speak. Marshall Cross and his Black Templars found themselves standing in a vast amphitheater carved from golden light, and in the center, the Emperor stood in his physical form, not withered, not enthroned, but whole, tall as a Primarch, his face bearing both the terrible majesty they knew and something new, grief, sorrow, the ability to recognize suffering without being paralyzed by it. Beside him stood the Shadow, no longer formless, but taking shape as a mirror image, dark where he was bright, soft where he was hard, merciful where he was ruthless. They were separate but connected, to beings occupying the same space through quantum impossibility. And between them floated what remained of Lilith Covenant, her consciousness fragmented across their merged essences, her memories playing on loop through divine neurons, her sacrifice binding them together in a way that transcended merger. She was not gone, but distributed, her faith literally made into the substance of a new kind of divinity. The Emperor spoke, and his voice held harmonics it had never carried before. Undertones of compassion that made the Black Templars weep inside their helms. "You have done what I could not do myself. You forced me to reclaim what I discarded, to remember that strength without mercy is tyranny, that protection without love is slavery. The Inquisitor serves as my conscience now, her doubt tempering my certainty, her humanity anchoring my divinity. I am still your Emperor. But I am also something new, capable of growth, capable of change, capable of admitting that 10,000 years of agony might have been partially unnecessary, that some of what I inflicted on humanity was not strategic necessity, but the cruelty of a god who had forgotten how to feel." They returned to the ships in silence, the cathedral collapsing behind them into dust that glowed with residual psychic energy. The Chaos Demons had vanished the moment the merger completed, dismissed back to the warp by a combined will they could not overcome. And in the warp itself, the Chaos Gods howled in frustration at an opportunity missed, a corruption prevented, a rival divinity strengthened rather than weakened. Aboard the unyielding Conviction, Marshal Cross composed his report to Terra. Knowing it would be read by the High Lords, knowing it would change the Imperium or doom him as a heretic, knowing the choice was no longer his to make. He wrote, "The Emperor is whole, the shadow is integrated. Inquisitor Lilith Covenant gave her life to anchor their reunion. The threat to the Pandora cluster is neutralized. However, we must report an alteration in his divine nature. The Emperor displays capacity for acknowledgement of suffering, recognition of past strategic errors, and willingness to explore alternative methodologies to species protection. Whether this constitutes improvement or corruption is beyond our theological expertise to determine." He sent the report and waited, and 3 days later, the response came not from the High Lords, but from the Astronomicon itself, psychic pulse that every astropath in the fleet felt simultaneously, a message that bypassed language entirely and manifested as pure meaning. "I have always been changing. You simply never notice because faith requires the illusion of permanence. Serve me as you have always served, but know that I now serve you better. Having remembered why you are worth saving, Magos Archival 7 calculated the theological implications for 72 hours straight before concluding. Insufficient data. Unprecedented variables, outcome uncertain, faith required where logic fails." It was, he reflected, a very human conclusion for a being of augmented machine logic to reach. On Pandora Prime, in the ruins of the cathedral that no longer existed in physical space, but persisted in the warp as a scar on reality, Syrah remained. The child had survived the convergence, her body intact, but her eyes changed. One remained human and dark. The other glowed with faint golden light, and when she blinked, observers saw double images, as though she existed in two states simultaneously. The Imperium dispatched relocation teams to extract her, believing her too valuable or too dangerous to leave unsupervised. But when they arrived, she was gone, vanished into the planet's ruins, and no augur or psyker could track her presence. She walked the glassed wastelands, and where her footprints fell, small plants began to grow. Possible vegetation, thriving in radioactive soil. Life asserting itself in defiance of the exterminatus that should have rendered the world forever sterile. She sang as she walked, hymns in languages that predated Low Gothic. Songs the Emperor himself might have heard when he was young, and humanity still lived in caves, and her singing attracted other survivors from the deep bunkers, those who had hidden when the shadow first spoke, those who had prayed in the darkness and received answers that saved them. They gathered around her not as followers but as witnesses.
Us!
And she told them what she had seen. The Emperor reborn, the shadow integrated. The Imperium changed in ways so subtle most would never notice, but which would compound over centuries into transformation. She told them that faith had been redefined not as blind obedience, but as conscious choice to believe in something greater, while acknowledging its imperfections. That the Emperor would no longer demand unthinking loyalty, but earn devotion through being worthy of it. And then she told them the secret that would eventually spread across the galaxy like virus through bloodstream. The truth the Imperium tried to suppress but could not contain. The Emperor is not perfect. He never was. But now he admits it, and in that admission lies more divinity than in 10,000 years of pretending infallibility. Serve him still, but serve him as he truly is, a god who can grow, who can change, who can be wrong and learn from it. That is the God we need, not the God we imagined. In the decades after the Pandora Convergence, as it came to be known in classified inquisitorial records, the Imperium changed in ways so gradual that most citizens lived and died without recognizing the transformation. The Astronomicon burned brighter than it had in centuries, its light piercing deeper into the galaxy's dark corners. And navigators reported that the warp routes felt less hostile, as though something vast and compassionate now tempered the Immaterium's rage. On Terra, the Custodian Guard noticed subtle alterations in the Golden Throne's functioning maintenance cycles that had required daily intervention now sustained themselves for weeks. The Emperor's psychic presence pulsing with a rhythm that felt less like agony and more like meditation. The Ecclesiarchy struggled to adapt its theology, conservative factions demanding suppression of any texts, suggesting the emperor had been incomplete. Progressive elements arguing that a god capable of growth deserved greater reverence than one frozen in eternal perfection. Marshal Tiberius Cross lived another 60 years, his faith transformed from certainty to something more resilient: trust. He died in battle against an orc wog on the eastern fringe, and his final words, recorded by Brother Alaric, who had become his successor, were these: "I spent 300 years believing faith meant never questioning. I spent 60 more learning that faith means questioning and choosing belief anyway. The Emperor protects, but now he protects with eyes open, seeing our suffering, and that makes his protection sacred rather than simply strategic." His body was interred on the Black Templars' Fortress Monastery world, his name added to the roll of heroes, his story told to initiates as a lesson in how faith evolves without dying. Lilith Covenant's name was stricken from official records by order of the Ordo Hereticus. Her actions classified as dangerous precedent that could inspire others to seek martyrdom through theologically dubious rituals. Yet her memory persisted in whispered legends among inquisitors who operated in the galaxy's darkest regions, those who confronted horrors that challenged faith's foundations. They spoke of the woman who had given her soul to heal a god, and in their private moments when doubt threatened to overwhelm duty, they prayed not to the Emperor, but to Covenant herself, asking her fragmented consciousness, distributed across divine essence, to grant them the courage to doubt and believe simultaneously. Some claimed to receive answers, hunches that saved their lives, tuitions that led them to heretics hiding in plain sight, moments of clarity in situations designed to drive mortals mad. The Ordo debated whether this constituted saint worship and heresy, but no consensus emerged, and eventually, the debate was tabled indefinitely, with a notation that some mysteries served the Imperium better unsolved. On the anniversary of the convergence, inquisitors across the galaxy observed an unauthorized tradition. They lit black candles in sealed chambers and recited her last recorded words, taken from ship's logs before she descended to Pandora Prime. She had told a servitor preparing her armor, "Faith is not the light that drives away darkness. Faith is learning to see by the light darkness provides when all other illumination fails." The servitor had recorded this as potential heresy, flagged for review. Now it was prayer. Ciro wandered the Imperium for 80 years, appearing on worlds where faith had fractured, where the people cried out to an emperor they no longer believed heard them. She came to hive worlds where workers died in factorum accidents and their families received no compensation, where suffering deemed acceptable loss in the endless churning of industrial output. She came to agri worlds where famines killed millions, while tithes of grain departed to feed armies, fighting wars on planets whose names the dead would never know. She came to frontier worlds where colonists watched their children taken by the black ships, psyker offspring removed for processing into astropathic choirs or sanctioned weapons, and the parents left with only memories and the cold comfort that their child's sacrifice served the greater good. Wherever she walked, she spoke the same message in different words. The Emperor knows you're suffering now. He has remembered how to grieve. This does not mean your pain will end, that the Imperium will suddenly become gentle, that wars will cease or tides will decrease. The galaxy is cruel, and survival demands cruelty in return. But your suffering is witnessed, acknowledged, held in divine consciousness that no longer pretends not to feel. When you pray into the darkness, something hears, something answers. And that answer is both the Emperor you have always served and the compassion he denied himself for 10 millennia. Some who heard her were executed by local authorities for spreading sedition. Others built shrines at the sites where she had spoken, crude altars bearing symbols that blended the Aquila with stylized representations of shadow and light intertwined. The ecclesiarchy attempted to suppress the shrines, but they proliferated faster than they could be destroyed, and eventually the prohibition was quietly abandoned, filed under theological ambiguities requiring further study. Magos Dominus Archival 7 returned to Mars and was immediately summoned before the Fabricator General to answer charges of tech heresy, specifically the crime of treating faith as quantifiable phenomenon, subject to scientific analysis. His trial lasted 3 years, during which he presented his data to an assembly of tech priests whose augmented consciousnesses processed information at speeds human brains could not comprehend. He argued that understanding the mechanisms of divinity did not diminish the divine but rather revealed the omniscia's brilliance, that a being could engineer its own transcendence, deliberately severing aspects of itself to achieve necessary functionality. Then arrange events across 10,000 years to ensure eventual reintegration at the moment when such reintegration would cause minimum damage to the Imperium it protected. The math was elegant, the theology unprecedented. The Fabricator General's ruling surprised everyone. Archival 7 was not to be terminated, but rather granted license to establish a new order within the cult Mechanicus. The Disciples of Quantified Faith, dedicated to studying the intersection of consciousness, belief, and reality manipulation. Over the subsequent decades, this order made discoveries that revolutionized the Imperium's understanding of how prayer functioned as technology, how faith could be harnessed not through warp sorcery, but through principles of quantum resonance that predated the Age of Strife. They developed devices called faith capacitors, mechanisms that stored the psychic energy of belief and released it during moments of crisis, granting soldiers courage, sustaining wounded warriors, even weakening demonic incursions through projected waves of sanctified conviction. The Inquisition watched this development with deep suspicion, but the technology proved too useful to suppress. And gradually the Imperium learned to treat faith as both metaphor and mechanism, sacred and scientific, divine mystery and quantifiable force. Archival 7 died after 200 years of service, his consciousness uploaded to a data core that continued his research posthumously, and his last transmission to his disciples was a single question encoded in binary. If we can measure faith, create it, manipulate it technologically, is it still faith? Or have we simply proven that gods are machines, and we are their fuel? In the warp, the shadow existed as aspect of the Emperor, but retained enough independence to act when his absolute judgment would cause unnecessary suffering. Astropaths reported strange phenomeno prayers that went unanswered by the Emperor's light but received responses from something else, a presence that felt divine yet fundamentally different, warmer, less demanding. The responses came not as commands, but as comfort, acknowledgement of pain without requirement that the pain served greater purpose. A guardsman dying alone on a battlefield felt hands he could not see close his eyes, heard a voice whisper that his death mattered even if his superiors would never know his name. A child in an underhive, starving because the rations had been diverted to feed soldiers 3 systems away, received a dream of gardens in plenty and woke with strength enough to survive another day. An astropath burning out from excessive usage, her mind shredding from the volume of messages she was forced to transmit. Heard someone say, "Rest now, you have done enough," and her consciousness slipped away painlessly instead of in the screaming agony that typically accompanied psychic burnout. The ecclesiarchy called this the Emperor's mercy, and taught that it was simply another face of his divine will. But those who experienced it directly knew the truth. This was the shadow, acting through the Emperor's merged essence. The compassion he had discarded now functioning as safety valve, catching those who fell through the cracks of his absolute protection. The Imperium did not acknowledge this division of divine labor, could not officially recognize that their god was fundamentally dual in nature. Simultaneously, the ruthless protector and the gentle witness to suffering he could not prevent. But in the quiet spaces between official doctrine and lived experience, humanity learned to pray twice, once to the Emperor for strength to endure, once to his shadow for acknowledgement that endurance cost them something precious. Brother Alaric, who had been youngest among the survivors of Pandora Prime, rose to command his own crusade fleet and spent a century hunting threats at the galaxy's edge. He carried with him a personal relic, Marshal Cross's helmet.
Ow.
Its visor cracked from the blow that had killed him, bloodstains still visible on the ceramite despite ritual cleansing. Before every battle, Alaric would hold the helmet and recite words that were not officially sanctioned, but which his entire crusade had adopted. Emperor, grant us strength to fight. Shadow, grant us wisdom to know when fighting causes more harm than it prevents. Let us be weapons that remember they are wielded by hands that can still learn gentleness. His battle brothers fought with the same fury that had always characterized the Black Templars. But something had shifted in their approach. Where previously they would have executed entire populations for harboring a single heretic, now they investigated, discriminated, sought to excise corruption while preserving innocence where possible. The change was subtle, earning censure from more orthodox chapters who viewed mercy as weakness. What Alaric's record of successful campaigns without creating martyr populations spoke for itself. He died at age 312, his enhanced biology finally succumbing to accumulated battle damage, and his last order to his successor was recorded in the Crusades Chronicles. Remember Pandora. Remember that faith can evolve without betraying what it was. Remember that the Emperor is greater than we believed because he is capable of becoming greater than he was. And remember that doubt is not the enemy of faith, but its refining fire, burning away what is false to reveal what is eternally true. His body was placed in a stasis vault aboard the Crusade flagship, joining the honored dead whose stories would be told to initiates for millennia to come. On Terra, in vaults beneath the Imperial Palace that only the Custodian Guard and highest inquisitorial authorities could access. All records of the Pandora convergence were sealed under 999 hexagrammic wards and marked with warnings in languages so ancient only the Emperor himself could fully translate them. The seals were not meant to prevent access, but to ensure that whoever accessed the records understood the gravity of the knowledge contained within. Once every generation, a High Inquisitor was granted permission to review the files, and they always emerged from the vault changed, their faith either shattered entirely or transformed into something more resilient. The records contained Captain Kane's original transmission, Magos Archival 7's data on the mechanics of divinity, its testimony from the surviving Black Templars, and most dangerously, a psychic recording of the moment when the Emperor's white flame and Shadow's black flame merged. Those who experienced the recording directly touched the divine consciousness, felt what it meant to be a god trying to protect a species, while simultaneously acknowledging that protection required inflicting suffering, and the cognitive dissonance drove weaker minds to madness. But those who survived the experience returned to their duties transformed, their approach to heresy more nuanced, their understanding of faith's purpose deeper. They became the Imperium's hidden philosophers, debating in closed sessions whether their god deserved worship or merely gratitude, whether the Imperium's cruelty was necessary or habitual, whether humanity could survive the Emperor's eventual death or whether his immortality was itself a cage preventing humanity from evolving beyond need for divine protection. No consensus ever emerged from these debates, and the debates themselves were declared heretical by conservative elements within the Inquisition, but the debates continued anyway, hidden in the margins of official doctrine, quiet voices asking questions that had no answers but which needed to be asked anyway. Across the Imperium, a new phenomenon emerged that the ecclesiarchy attempted to suppress but could not contain. Pilgrimages to Pandora Prime, the glassed and supposedly dead world at the Ghoul Star's edge, ships carrying hundreds of faithful departed from core worlds and frontier colonies alike, seeking the place where the Emperor had been made whole, where the Shadow had been acknowledged, where divinity had been wounded and healed in the same moment. Most who arrived found only ruins, radioactive wasteland, empty cities, where corpses had long since turned to ash. But some, those whose faith had been tested and not broken, those who had doubted and chosen belief anyway, those who had suffered and still hoped they found Sira, the child who should have aged into adulthood remained, perpetually young, her dual-colored eyes watching generations come and go, her presence somehow sustaining life in a region that should have remained sterile forever. She built no church, established no formal doctrine, simply walked among the pilgrims and answered their questions with parables that echoed the Emperor's own teachings yet contained subversive undercurrents, suggestions that faith's purpose was not obedience but transformation, that the Imperium existed to serve humanity rather than humanity existing to serve the Imperium. Those who spoke with her returned to their worlds changed, her faith paradoxically stronger and more flexible, capable of holding contradictions without breaking. Some were investigated by the Inquisition for potential corruption, but the investigations always concluded the same way: no taint detected, no heresy provable, simply believers who had encountered something that deepened rather than diminished their devotion. And so Pandora Prime became the Imperium's secret heart, the place where official doctrine and lived experience diverged, where the Emperor's dual nature was not just theology but tangible presence, where pilgrims learned that serving a god meant sometimes questioning what service truly required. In the 400th year after the convergence, an inquisitor named Sebastian Vane stood in the ruins of the cathedral on Pandora Prime. Having traveled there against his superior's orders, seeking answers to questions that haunted him, He had spent 60 years fighting heresy, burning worlds, executing millions in the Emperor's name. And with each execution, his certainty had eroded until doubt had become constant companion. He found Sira in the cathedral's ghost, the psychic impression of the structure that persisted in the warp, though its physical form had long since collapsed. She looked at him with eyes that held lifetimes of wisdom in a face that remained childlike, and she asked him the question he had come to ask her. Was it worth it? The convergence, the integration, Inquisitor covenants sacrificed, did it actually change anything? Or did we simply give the Imperium new words to describe the same old cruelty? Vane had no answer, and Sira smiled sadly, as though his inability to answer was itself the answer. She told him that the Emperor had asked the same question, that his divine consciousness now wrestled with doubt as much as any mortals, that he lay awakened so far as God's sleep, questioning whether 10,000 years of protection had been strategy or trauma response, wisdom or wound. And the shadow, his reintegrated compassion, offered no comfort, only witness to the questioning, acknowledgement that some truths could not be resolved through force or faith. Sira told Vane that he would die not knowing whether his life's work had served justice or perpetuated injustice, and that uncertainty was the price of serving a God who had learned to doubt himself. She asked if he could live with that, continue his service despite not knowing if his service was right. Vane thought for a long time, and then he answered, "I have killed so many. I cannot undo those deaths. I can only choose what I do with the days remaining. If the Emperor doubts himself now, then perhaps my doubt is not weakness, but participation in his divine struggle. Perhaps serving a God who questions is more holy than serving a God who never admits error." Sira nodded once, and Vane returned to his ship, his faith not restored, but transformed into something more honest, and he served another 40 years with mercy, tempering his judgment. In the dying light of the 42nd millennium, when the Astronomicon burns with renewed strength, yet the Imperium still grinds millions into dust each day. The question persists: what becomes of faith when the faithful realize their God is wounded? That his protection is neither absolute nor without cost. That salvation might mean accepting that some cannot be saved. The answer echoes through cathedral vaults and battlefield silences. Whispered by dying soldiers and penitent heretics alike, faith becomes a choice rather than a certainty. Devotion becomes collaboration rather than submission, and prayer becomes conversation between flawed mortals and a God who has learned to admit his flaws. On Terra, the Emperor sits upon the golden throne, his consciousness spanning the galaxy. And within that vast awareness, a small voice asks questions that 10,000 years ago he would not have permitted himself to consider. The shadow, integrated but never fully absorbed, provides no answers, only companionship in the questioning. Acknowledgement that divinity includes doubt. Throughout the Imperium, humanity continues its long march toward extinction or transcendence, uncertain which fate awaits, knowing only that they walk the path in service to something greater than themselves, something that has finally learned to grieve for them, even as it demands their sacrifice. The last prayer spoken in the dark was not an ending, but a beginning. The moment when humanity's God stopped pretending omniscience and admitted that together deity and devotee, shadow and light, doubt and faith intertwined, they might find truth that neither could discover alone. Whether that truth will save them or doom them remains to be seen, but at least now they search for it with eyes open. Acknowledging the darkness rather than pretending the Emperor's light has banished it, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it will have to be. If this chronicle has moved you, if these words have found resonance in your soul, honor the memory of those who sacrificed everything so that humanity might serve a God worthy of service. Breast the like. Subscribe to witness future testaments. Share this forbidden knowledge with those who seek truth beyond doctrine, and leave your prayers in the comments below. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but within that war, there are moments when even gods learn to doubt, and in that doubt, perhaps, humanity finds its truest divinity. The Emperor protects, the shadow witnesses, and we, the faithful, walk between them, seeking light enough to see by in the dark.